I've got 2 yoga blocks I got from Amazon and a PVC pipe. This will form the base of the hammer. First of all, make sure you've cut your pipe to size. So I want this pipe to go through the middle of the yoga blocks, but there's obviously material in the way. So I need to remove that material. So what I do is I take both halves, I find the centre, I turn the yoga block around to find the centre again, and now we've got a line marked out on the top and the inside. Now I'm marking out the width of the PVC pipe onto the yoga block. I'm marking out where I want the PVC pipe to go so that it's central. Obviously it's not going to go all the way down to the bottom here. We'll stop at a couple of inches up from that. So the part I've marked out is the area that we're going to remove. And because it's a curve, I curve it round on the top. To remove material, I'm taking a box cutter knife and cutting at an angle on both sides. I keep cutting until the material comes loose, and then I take it out. We need the PVC pipe to go into this hole halfway, and at the moment there's still too much material. I take some sandpaper and sand it to make it more curved so that the PVC pipe fits into the hole. So this is what we're looking for here. Now repeat this on the other side, and you'll have 2 halves. Make sure the PVC pipe goes happily inside the hole, and we can use a set square to make sure it's straight. You want to make sure you don't have a squint handle on your hammer. This is not necessary, but I created some scores and roughed up the surface before gluing, just to get a really strong bond. I take some contact cement and apply it to both surfaces. Once the glue was ready, I then joined these parts together. Just be careful as you want these to be lined up perfectly. Note that I don't have any glue on the PVC pipe at this moment. It's loose, so we can just pull that straight back out. I would leave in while you're gluing these parts though, as you need to make sure that these channels line up inside. And then you've got your base now. You can remove the PVC pipe for the time being. This means when you're working on the head part, it's much easier to lay it flat. So the edges of the hammer are actually beveled, so that's what I'm marking out now. You want the bevel to be the same all around the edges. Just make sure when you're marking that all the markings line up. Then you want to remove the material. Obviously just now I'm using a sanding block and sandpaper. I totally forgot at the time that I have a rotary sander, which made the process so much quicker, so I did do some of this with the rotary sander. I do use it later to refine the bevels, so you'll see a little bit of it there. Basically the main thing is that you remove this material, make sure it's straight and even. For the little corners here, I actually use a Dremel. So I want you to take note of this because I made this mistake where the yoga blocks weren't long enough. So what I should have done at the start is add extra foam to the sides. But since I had added the bevel already, what I did was I just added some extra foam to the end of the bevel. So if you're adding any extra material to your yoga blocks, do that before beveling. So I took some 5mm foam and added these to both sides. So obviously these yoga blocks had bevels on them already, and what I need to do is fill these so they're flat. So I take some foam clay and just run it around the whole of the bevels that are there. What I would make sure with the foam clay is that you add enough, because if you go and paint it then you might see a channel running down it. I add the foam clay all around these bevels and inside the part I've just glued, so I just pushed the foam clay right into that hole. While the foam clay was setting, I thought I would start adding in some cracks. So I took a gold pen and roughly marked out where I felt like they should be. If you're really pernickety and want it to be exactly the same as the one in the film, then just look at a reference photo and try to copy the cracks and where they are. There's also some detail at the bottom of the hammer. So what I do is measure and mark out 2 symmetrical lines. Then I find the centre and draw 2 angled lines on either side. To remove material for these, I'm using a soldering iron. I'm taking my time because I really want to sell the idea that these are precise lines, and this can be quite difficult with a soldering iron. So once I'd added in this bottom detail, I then went and soldered all these cracks that I'd drawn in. So all you need to do is just run the soldering iron over all the lines that you've marked in. And then to make it a bit more realistic, I just thicken some of the joins of where the cracks meet. Remember, you don't have to exactly copy where you've drawn these lines. Just use them as a guide. So you can see I'm only doing the sides at the moment because there's foam clay and those other parts that I'm leaving to set. So the next day, once your foam clay has dried, you can then sand it down. I would use a sanding block because you want it to lie as flat as possible. Then what to do is find the centre on the top and then draw a circle for the cylinder that goes on the top. Once you've marked on the cylinder, you can add more cracks in. And what to do is make sure they continue from the cracks on the side. When you solder over foam clay, it doesn't like it as much, but it will solder. You might have to just go over it a couple of times. Notice I'm not adding cracks to where the cylinder's to go. I want to glue this to a flat surface, so there's no point in putting cracks right under here. So for the cylinder at the top, I cut these on my Cricut. Both of these are 2mm foam, and for one of them I designed this on Inkscape, and it's basically all the sort of symbols and lettering that goes on the outside. What I do is I add contact cement to both of these and then join them together so it's 4mm. Designing this on my Cricut made this really as clean as possible, with all the sort of symbols lined up, but obviously I'm not leaving it like this because it doesn't stand out very much. But what this does do is it gives me a guide for the solder and iron. So with the solder and iron, I just go over each and every line that's there. You can see using the solder and iron has been quite effective here. I continue going over every single line, and when I was finished it looked like this. I quickly go around the edges of the cylinder and just make sure they're flat at the sides. So around the extra foam I added at the sides, I added foam clay and left that to dry overnight, and then I used my rotary sander to refine that bevel. Next, I'm adding a design to the bevels, so you do need to make sure your bevels are big enough to take this design. I quickly cut it out on my Cricut. This was an early draft with my design, so it's not perfect, but it gave me a good guide on where to glue everything. Then I took a silver pen and marked in where the design should go. Now I actually cut this design out with a Cricut. To store them, I put them in a little box like this. It's really easy to lose little bits of foam like this. I cut these out of 2mm foam, but what you could do is maybe cut it out of 1mm foam and just cut it with scissors if you transfer the pattern. So I glue these on with contact cement and it does take a long time. I don't have a 3D printer or anything like that yet, so this was the best option at the time. You can see that the pattern is starting to emerge. I obviously didn't stand in the garage for the whole of this. I actually sat in my kitchen and listened to a podcast. This does take a long time because you've got 8 of these to do. So once they're all on, it should look something like this. I also designed a border that goes round this. I cut it with my Cricut out of 2mm foam. And I just glue this onto every single one of the bevels. The biggest task here is making sure it's straight when it goes on. I use a steel rule just to gently guide it into place. I also cut some tiny little bits of 2mm foam and glued them to the top of the smaller bevels, just to continue that all the way round. After the patterns are on, continue the cracks down them. Note that you can use the cracks to your advantage here. If you make a mistake and something looks a bit strange, just put a crack in there and it will hide it. Make sure the cracks join up. What I also decided to do was add some texture using the soldering iron. And to add extra detail, I used my Dremel with varying sizes. When I'd finished it looked like this. Now we're going to glue on the top piece. Just make sure it's central. And now all that's done, we can go ahead and glue the handle on. First of all, I put the PVC pipe inside the head and mark where it stops. I'm now going to cover the visible part of the handle with 2mm EVA foam. To work out the width, you can use the circumference equals 2 pi r equation. Or you can do it this quick way, put a little mark and roll it back until the mark hits the foam again and just add a little excess. Now I mark where to cut. And I cut this foam out with an X-Acto knife. I quickly double check that the foam is big enough to go around the pipe. So before gluing anything to plastic, the plastic's really smooth, so it's a really good idea to rough up the surface. So to do that, I use some rough sandpaper. I mark out the top just to remind myself which side is going inside the head. Add contact cement to the foam and contact cement to the PVC pipe, and once ready to get glued, join these together. When doing this, I make sure the PVC pipe is straight so that when I roll it on the foam, either side of the foam should match up. When you get to the join, just use your fingers to press the foam right into that seam, and then remove any excess with scissors. Now we've obviously got some excess left in the form of like a bump, so get your Dremel and Dremel that away. You're basically just trying to flatten it down as much as you can. After that, get some wet and dry paper and just smooth it down even more to refine it. So now we've got a handle that's covered in foam and we can attach that to the head. My glue of choice here is Gorilla Glue. The Gorilla Glue will expand 3 times its size. So inside that hole, the glue will go into all the nooks and crannies and make the bond a lot stronger. So with Gorilla Glue, you need to activate it with water. So I take a little spray gun filled with water and spray it into the hole. I also spray the part of the handle that's to get glued. Now I add some glue into the hole. You don't need tons and tons, you just need a bit because remember it does expand. I also add some glue to the PVC pipe. And now I push it down into the hole. If you do this slowly, it will avoid the glue sort of glooping out the top as much. And if you twist it while it goes down, it helps to spread the glue around. So once it's in the hole, there will be some excess glue poking out. Just get a bit of foam and wipe that off, but do not get this on your fingers. Before leaving it to set, I take my set square and just make sure that it's straight. I'm using some baking paper underneath just to avoid getting glue on it. I gently nudge the handle so it's straight. Then I leave it to dry. For the detail that goes down the length of the handle, I created this design on Cricut and cut it out with my Cricut. There's 10 of these to go on, and I need them to be evenly spaced apart. I decide where I'm putting the first one and then divide the space between the rest of the handle evenly. When you've made all your markings, it should look a bit like this. Then what I do is add some contact cement to the area I'm going to glue, and I add glue to the detail. Once the glue has been spread and is ready to glue, I then add this to the handle. For each marking, I put the very point of the V onto that marking. And what I would also recommend is to make markings on the other side that match up both sides. Once you've glued the first one, take a look at it and make sure it's straight looking. It's quite easy for these to go off at an angle. Once happy, just continue this right down the length of the handle. Once they're all on, it should look a bit like this. Don't worry about all the excess glue because we will clean that up later. To add the little detail that's under the head, I'm actually going to use a foam ruler that I made. I wrap the foam ruler around the handle, and I can see roughly how long this 5mm piece is to be. I can then go to my 5mm foam, mark out that length, and cut out a small rectangle. Now when I wrap it around, it should snugly go on, and if there's a tiny bit of excess, you can just cut off that tiny little bit. I add a bevel to one side with my Dremel. Then I put some glue on both edges. Spread it, wait till it dries, and then wrap these around the handle and join them together. Now we're going to join this part to the head, so we put some contact cement to the base of the head, contact cement to the base of that part. Once happy, I just lower this piece and then glue it together. I also cut a very thin rectangle out of 2mm EVA foam, and I wrap that around the top of the piece I've just made. At the end of the handle there's a leather strap. I had some scrap leather, so I just cut a long rectangle out of that. One of the main problems I had to solve making this hammer was how I was going to get the strap to connect, as it appears to go inside the part at the end. So I came up with the idea of making a little hat. I measured the inner diameter of the PVC pipe. I then cut this many times out of Worbla. I did this roughly 6 times. Now I'm going to connect all these circles to make a cylinder. So with Worbla you can just add heat and then join those straight together. So my main aim for this is that it fits inside the inner diameter of the PVC pipe. It was still a bit too wide, so I then heat this cylinder and then roll it until it got a little smaller. Once happy with that, I then dremeled any excess foam from the end of the handle. If you imagine a hat, the little cylinder I've just made is the top of the hat. Now we're making the rim of the hat, so we need this part to be a bit bigger. I join up a couple of these circles, and then I join it to the thinner cylinder. Now you can see if we put the hat into the bottom, it acts a bit like a plug. Now I'm cutting more shapes out of the Worbla. This time it's like a D shape. There's two. I cut this several times as well until it matches the depth of the leather. You can see I'm adding heat and then joining these to the edges. The area left inside should allow the leather to be laid flat. You can see it's like a channel and I could run this leather straight through. Before I glue this leather on, I'm going to add colour. I didn't have any leather dyes at the time, so I just used paint. The base colour I'm using is called Burnt Umber, but I do end up adding reds and blues to make it slightly more purple. I just take a little sponge and add some of the colour straight on. I build up the same colour over the whole of the leather strap, including the underside, because you will see that. I made this scrap piece for another part of the project, but I know this is the colour I want for the strap, so I'm using that as a basis. You can see this needs to be more purple, so I add blue and I add red. I then get my cloth again and just run it along the whole of the strap. It takes away some of the paint and creates these lighter areas, but I quite liked that, so I kept that. Now we're connecting the strap to the little hat. So add contact cement to the Worbla and contact cement to the ends of the leather. So the first side of the leather gets glued halfway, making sure that the underside of the leather is facing up. And then I join the other side. This is what we now should have. For the very end of the handle, I designed this piece. There should be two on either side. I cut this on my Cricut. I drew around this piece of foam and then cut it out of Worbla. I then glue the Worbla onto the foam. Now I add some heat and curve this round. We'll leave this top part open for the time being, as we need to glue the strap inside first and then close that down. I'm now going to glue these pieces to the handle. Just note of which way round they should go. So with the leather part inside the handle, I then glue these parts on. Note that the leather part is not glued inside the PVC pipe yet. I wanted to add these parts first so that when I glue the actual leather strap in, that it's actually sitting properly. Once those are both glued on, I then take some sandpaper around a wooden dowel and I sand the inside of the pipe. This is so that when I glue the Worbla plug inside, it's more likely to have a stronger bond. My glue of choice is Gorilla epoxy glue. I usually like to use this when I'm gluing two pieces of plastic together. Epoxy glue comes in two parts. You mix the two parts evenly for roughly 20 seconds. The glue activates and then you can apply. So I add this glue onto the inside of the PVC pipe and I add it to the Worbla. I also add a little bit around the edges. Then I carefully push the little hat plug down into the hole. So you need to leave that undisturbed for about 30 minutes. I usually leave it for about an hour. Once set, you should be able to lift it up like this. There's some detail going onto this part, so I created a little stencil and cut it out on my Cricut. There's very little detail going in this part, so I didn't bother cutting it out in detail. I just really wanted an outline of where to put everything. So again, I designed this part on Inkscape. So once I'd marked out roughly where all the little parts are to go, I then glue these on. Once I had finished, it looked like this. So we can still see the underside of the leather here and it looks a bit unfinished. So I cut some Worbla circles big enough to go inside the end piece. I do this several times, heat them and join them up to make a cylinder. I place it on the end of the handle to make sure it's the right size. Once happy, I then heat the end piece and then I curve the top of it to close. I do this with the cylinder inside to get the right shape. Now I'm going to glue the cylinder on, so I add contact cement to the bottom, contact cement to the ends of the handle, and then glue this on. Once finished, it looked like this. So I also designed a surround for this end piece, which I cut out with my Cricut. All I do is glue this on around what I already have. Before painting the hammer, I'm going to clean it up. So I'm using Evo Stick Adhesive Cleaner. I apply this to a cloth and gently remove any excess glue. I then heat seal the hammer with a heat gun. This helps to close the open cells in the foam, so it takes the primer and paint a lot better. After using a heat gun, it's a good idea to go round all the glued parts and make sure they haven't come up. If any have come up, just fix that now. Next, I wipe down the hammer with a damp cloth. This will remove any remaining dust from the surface. Now we can start adding a primer. I use Flex Bond for this. I've chosen Flex Bond because it retains detail well. It's an excellent primer. All I do is make sure that my paintbrush is wet, add some Flex Bond and then spread it evenly. Don't apply it too thick. After 30 minutes, apply the second coat of Flex Bond. I keep applying the Flex Bond, and if there's any cracks, I just make sure that it goes inside those cracks. After another 30 minutes, add your third coat of Flex Bond. Once you've finished the head of the hammer, you can do the underside and the handle at once. If you've watched my Mighty Thor armour tutorials, you'll see that I have this method of adding paint and sanding it down to make it a bit smoother. The brush strokes on this will not be as obvious because most of it isn't getting shiny paint. However, I do this technique just to get it looking a bit smoother because it is meant to be made of metal. So I add this paint, it's gloss black paint, and when I sand it, it's really easy to see if it's smooth or not. After a couple of coats, I take some fine sandpaper and just sand it down so it's just a little bit smoother. I also want to note that you can still see the channels of where I added foam clay, and I never realised how prominent these would look at the time, so I do actually go and fix that later. The way my hammer looks now, you can't see those at all. So you can see after sanding, all the matte bits are the bits that have been smoothed down. Anything that's kinda still glossy, they're obviously on a lower level. But as long as I've got a lot of it smooth, a lot of it matte, then I'm just going to leave it like that. The first paint I'm adding is a dark brown to the handle. I'm adding this with an airbrush so the paint is nice and even. After each layer, leave it to dry, add another layer until you're happy with the colour. After several coats, you can see the browns starting to become a lot more prominent. Now you can see I've masked out the entirety of the handle. So after adding some gloss black again to these parts, I then cover it with chrome. The thing with the chrome is you're meant to see the gloss black underneath still. The chrome just gets put on very lightly. That's what gives it that shine. Once the chrome had dried, I then removed all of the masking. Now the head of the hammer is not as shiny, so I'm using a steel airbrush paint for this. I spray this over the entirety of the head of the hammer. Just watch out when you're doing the side next to the handle, as you'll need to mask the handle out. Now that the steel paint is on, you can see it's looking a bit flat. So now I'm going to go in with some black acrylic paint and give it like a black wash. I mix some water with the black acrylic paint and wash it on the sides. I then remove the excess with some kitchen roll. I continue doing this until I'm happy with the effect. You can see it's starting to look a bit more realistic. The best thing about these black washes is that the darkest colour goes inside those cracks and really makes them stand out. Also with the details on the end here, it really makes them pop a lot more. So after you've completed this step, the hammer is complete. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial and thanks for watching.